What does Pot of Greed really do? We all know the meme, and the anime never wastes an opportunity to spell out the simple effect. But drawing two cards has such a profound impact on the game that I think Pot of Greed deserves its own video exploration. Part of the impetus behind this video is an old argument that Pot of Greed does not need to be banned, because it is perhaps the only card in the game which benefits any deck that includes it. There is probably a corner case in which this is not true, and the closest I have come up with is in a mutual mill deck like Empty Jar. But even in that case, the easy card advantage and consistency the card offers far exceeds running an effectively 38 card deck, for mill purposes at least. Those two aspects of the card, a +1 in card advantage, and consistency through means of deck thinning, really set the Greedy Pot apart from other similar cards. There are a total of 10 pot cards released so far, a few of which will be referenced. But both the Greed and Treasure card series will eventually get their own video, with each being more geared to looking at how far a duelist is willing to go for card advantage. For the longest time, Thunder Dragon was just a +1 in terms of card advantage, with the two Thunder Dragons added to hand not being particularly useful, most often offering a bit of discard fodder and maybe some graveyard setup. Thunder Dragon did have the risk of being dead when drawing 3 copies, or just less alive when drawing 2. There is a similar problem with Gather Your Mind and Spell Power Grasp, both of which also deck thin, but offer arguably less useful cards in the process. This is due to the fact that they each have a hard once per turn activation restriction. Toon Table of Contents avoids this problem, and is made even better by being able to tutor itself, as well as a small pool of other Toon cards. But that is going into card selection, which goes beyond material card advantage and enters the domain of virtual card advantage. That is beyond the scope of this video. Instead, I want to focus on a few cards which may be argued to be Pot of Greed retrains. Believe it or not, all of these cards have seen competitive play. First up is Jar of Greed, which is a 0 in terms of material card advantage, but can effectively shrink the deck size by 1 for each copy which is run. Sort of. There is an implicit assumption that the game is slow enough to set the trap card, then activate it during the opponent's turn at earliest. Being delayed a turn is quite the downside, which further depreciates the value of the card as the game continues to accelerate. Upstart Goblin is faster, with the downside of giving your opponent 1000 life points, but shrinking the deck size on the first turn, being one of Yu-Gi-Oh's very few cantrips. Although offering no material card advantage, that small amount of deck thinning is quite strong. The boost in consistency is noticeable, with each Upstart Goblin played increasing the odds of hitting at least a single copy of a 3-of in the opening hand by about 1%. Remember that Pot of Greed not only shrinks the deck size by 2, but when drawn, increases the opening hand size from 5 to 6. In that case, 1 copy of Pot of Greed is an 8% boost in consistency by itself. Interestingly, there is actually a Pot of Greed retrain which does not deck thin. Pot of Avarice returns 5 monsters from the graveyard to the deck, which actually introduces new problems. The big one is enabling loops which special summon from the deck. A good example being the windup hand loop with Zen Mighty. I believe that the rationale behind this card was that getting to 5 monsters in graveyard was quite a task, and would therefore delay the card a few turns. Though acceleration of the game, and especially mechanics like Synchro Summon, have lowered this bar considerably. There are 2 more greedy cards that I want to draw attention to, each of which draws 2 cards, Reckless Greed and Shard of Greed. Reckless Greed has seen quite a bit of competitive play, despite being a turn slower than Upstart Goblin. Although, unlike Upstart Goblin, Reckless Greed is actually a -1 in card advantage. Skipping the next 2 draw phases is not the only downside of the card, since the trap card is also a resource from hand. The draw phase skip effect is not cumulative, so multiple copies activated in the same turn will still only result in the next 2 draw phases being skipped, making the second copy of the card effectively a +1 in card advantage. In a longer game, Reckless Greed would probably not see play outside of gimmicky strategies. However, from time to time it does see play, in formats when games are effectively decided in the first few turns, either through an OTK or FTK, or an insurmountable board position. Shard of Greed, on the other hand, is hard-locked to a 3-round clock, since it can only accumulate counters during the draw phase and only once per turn. To me, this is a pretty good balance point in terms of free card advantage, since it not only has a time gate, but a weakness to spell and trap removal. This small amount of opportunity for opponent interaction introduces a nice bit of risk and reward. Not only that, it can bait out a mystical Space Typhoon which might otherwise hit a more important target. I am not sure where the exact balancing point is as far as a draw 2 card, and part of the reason is that it is a moving goalpost to hit, as the game continues to accelerate with decks becoming more aggressive and consistent over time. But I think there is a lot more to Pot of Greed than just those 3 little words in the text box.